welcome to The Election Show. I'm your host, Dr. Christina Greer, Associate Professor of Political Science at Fordham University and the co-host of the FAQ NYC podcast. Joining me today via Zoom is Matt McDermott, Communication Strategist and Vice President of Whitman Insight Strategies, and also with me is political analyst and Professor of Political Science at Columbia University, Lincoln Mitchell. Hello, gentlemen. How are you?
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving. Happy Native American Reflection. The word of the day, though, is transition, transition, transition. Matt, I will start with you because you can barely hold your grin. I've been following you on Twitter, and you've had so many great insights about this transition. So we know that Emily Murphy, who's the GSA administrator, has finally sent President-elect Joe Biden a letter saying that we can begin the transition process, largely by releasing the funds. I believe it's $6.3 million, so that he can get started on the road to his presidency. I thought it was pretty interesting that she addressed the letter as Mr. Biden and not President-elect Biden. We saw the president tweeted that he supports that decision, but he also vowed to keep fighting. I believe today he and his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, are in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, still dredging up the base and keeping them excited about the fight. The president has still refused to concede. But where are we right now in this transition process? Are you feeling comfortable with what has transpired in the last few days, or lay this out for us?
Look, I think there's good news and bad news in what's happened over the last few weeks. I mean, the good news is that precariously our system of democracy has held. The systems that ensure a peaceful transfer of power are working largely as intended. You've seen states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia now over the last few weeks certify their election results, thus ensuring that Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States. And as you mentioned, the General Services Administration and other parts of the federal government are now working with the Biden transition team to ensure that transition happens in an effective and an efficient way before the inauguration on January 20th. So in that regard, things are working as intended. I think the concern, though, that many, including Lincoln, have long brought up over the months heading into the election were in fact valid. I mean, it is hard to understate just how close to a constitutional crisis we came as a country over the past few weeks, wherein the president was essentially inviting state lawmakers into the White House to pressure them to overturn the results of the free and fair election that took place. And you've seen both the president and other members of his administration taking to Twitter, taking to the networks over the past few weeks, and essentially calling into question the validity of this election. We were very close to a situation in which Trump tried to hold power through completely undemocratic and un-American ways. And had the election map turned out slightly differently, say, for instance, had President-elect Biden not won Georgia and not won Arizona, and this had just come down to Pennsylvania, I think we'd be sitting in a very different situation right now, where the incumbent president, Donald Trump, would have been pressuring lawmakers in that state to overturn the results in that state and thus secure the presidency. We were incredibly close to a constitutional issue. And so I hope we remember that moving forward, regardless of the fact that it looks like moving forward, the Biden transition will happen as seamlessly as possible in the era of Donald Trump. I think it calls into question the systems we have in place and suggests that there really do need to be some structural reforms to ensure that we're never in this situation again.
Right. I mean, I think it's so interesting, Matt, because Donald Trump is the type of man that the framers warned us about. When you read the Federalist Papers, when you remember why they put so many sort of trap doors within the Constitution, it's because they were always feared that we might have someone like this. We've never been this close to a constitutional crisis, or someone refusing to accept the results of a free and fair election. I mean, Lincoln, I was just watching an interview with President Obama, and he said that when he won. Now, granted, this isn't him beating George Bush. I mean, it was an open seat, but he said that immediately the Bush administration handed over everything and essentially said, whatever it is you need for the next 2.5 months, please let us know, because we cannot, endanger ourselves to the foreign entities We need to make sure that this recession doesn't turn into a depression. We've got a lot on our plate and we need to keep moving. It boggles my mind that we're in the middle of a global pandemic with over a quarter of a million Americans who have died, 11 plus million more who were infected by COVID-19, and the president doesn't want to have a seamless transition. And so he's fighting this tooth and nail still. He's definitely backed off quite a bit. He's insulting members of his own party who have said, I voted for him twice. My family voted for him. I support him completely. But for essentially breaking the law, I'm not willing to do that. I'm not willing to overturn the results of a free election. But we see that the president still has many millions of Americans who not only support him, but are financially invested in seeing that he maintains office. They are donating to these efforts of stop the steal, making sure that Joe Biden does not become the 46th president. What can you tell us about that angle where the president seems like he's grifting even as he walks out the door?
Well, I just want to raise something here. Matt spoke about how we avoided a constitutional crisis. We didn't avoid a constitutional crisis. We were deep in a constitutional crisis. We avoided the collapse of our democracy. But Donald Trump created that constitutional crisis. We've been in a constitutional crisis since he's been president. So we should be clear here. The Constitution did not save us. We kind of got lucky. I would also add, I'll get to your question, that the Constitution really does tell us what to do about a guy like Donald Trump, a president like Donald Trump, but it doesn't tell us what to do about a Senate led by someone like Mitch McConnell, right? So it was the Vichy Republicans here who were as much responsible for this crisis because they could have stopped this at so many points along the way. Your question about Donald Trump is important because when looking at Donald Trump's political motivations, we have to remember it's always about attention and money and staying out of jail as things have gotten bad. So when we look at his actions, not just since the election, but going forward, he has to keep that money coming in because he's funneling it out, right? The grift is always going to be there. And some of that money is going to end up in his pocket, in his family's pocket. I mean, a lot of RNC contributions have gone to things like buying copies of Don Jr.'s books to give to donors, which is really not something that's going to be would do to help an election, right? That's just grift. The question that comes to mind here is, will he be successful, right? Can he generate the kinds of millions of dollars, one, to pay the legal fees, which is of peripheral importance for Trump because he never pays his lawyers anyway, but to pay the legal fees, but also to pay the fees associated with keeping Trump in the spotlight, right? He wants to, whether or not he actually wants to run for president in 2024, he wants to be a public figure. He needs those rallies. That is his oxygen, the attention that those rallies generate, but they're expensive. And can he continue to do that? He'll need to raise money. The other thing I would point out is one structural question that this raises is that this 11-week transition period is something from another era. It was something from a time, it used to be March until I believe when FDR was president, because you had to get to Washington by horse. You know, you had to assemble your cabinet by horseback and through the telegram or mail. When we have a situation where the party is changing and when the outgoing president clearly has ill will, not just to the new president, but to the people of the United States, to condense this, Trump can do a lot more damage in 11 weeks than he could in, 5, 6, or 7. And you could do a transition in 5, 6, or 7. So as we revisit these systems, I think we should revisit that one as well.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree because everyone's eyes are turned to the magical date of January 20th. January 20th, January 20th. That honestly is the day that I think I will be able to breathe a real sigh of relief. When Joe Biden won Pennsylvania and people were dancing in the streets across the country, I definitely was cautiously optimistic just because we know who we're dealing with. And we know that Donald Trump feeds off of attention. And so as long as we keep saying his name, it's almost as though it gets bigger and bigger. I think the date that I want to focus on is December 14th, where the election results are certified. And Matt, it seems as though, states are following the Constitution. Minnesota, Nevada, New Mexico, and the District of Columbia, all won by Joe Biden. They're scheduled to certify on Tuesday. Indiana and North Carolina, which Trump won, they're also scheduled to be certified. And any challenges to these results have to be resolved by December 8th. So are you confident that we're looking toward a relatively seamless December 14th, where all 50 states will do what they're supposed to do? We saw the president threatening that, he would make sure that he held it up in courts and the Republicans would do the right thing and refuse to cast ballots for Joe Biden because it's not fair and the winner take all system. How are you feeling about December 14th? That leads us then into January 20th.
Yeah, I'm certainly feeling more confident than I was over the past few weeks. I mean, the president and his team has essentially run out of options at this point, right? Is most states where they did have some state and local opportunities to quite literally steal the election have essentially vanished in places like Georgia and places like Michigan and Pennsylvania. And those certifications have moved ahead. It feels like they're basically out of options. They also don't really have a legal path at this point. They've lost now over 35 legal cases and really don't have a path to get any of the remaining cases up to the Supreme Court. So essentially, they've run out of options. I think the thing we should be cognizant of, though, over the next few weeks is it's evident that his legal team is going to continue moving forward with their drumming that's happening around the country about fraud and about conspiracies and about just ludicrous reasons why the results of this election shouldn't be counted. I think we should start asking why, because they're not doing it for a legal reason. And it would appear, based on new reporting out late this week, that Donald Trump himself is already considering a pardon of Rudy Giuliani prior to his removal from office on January 20th to rid him of any legal challenges that might come his way given his conduct during this election. If Rudy Giuliani is going around the country spouting about conspiracy theories in response to a potential pardon from the president, that itself is a crime. And I think we should start thinking about why it is that this legal team is doing what they're doing, given that they don't actually have a credible legal challenge to make. And if it is, in fact, to get a pardon out of this administration before they leave office, that itself is yet another criminal activity on behalf of this administration. So I think we just need to be cognizant over the last few weeks of this Trump White House of what they do in terms of pardons, because if it is the end of a presidency that leads to pardons of Giuliani, of Roger Stone, it sounds like the Kushner family might get a pardon as well. That's a real problem that Democrats need to be ready to challenge.
Right. And so, Lincoln, I wanted you to respond essentially to the same question. How are you feeling about December 14th and what we have to look forward to January 20th? You know, in addition to what Matt just said, I mean, Matt, I've also been really worried, not just about the pardons, but the executions that Bill Barr has lined up. We've already sentenced one man to death in a very dubious case in Florida. And now it looks like there are 3 more in the docket for this month alone before we even get into December. So that's actually something, as Lincoln mentioned, the damage that the president can do in these latter weeks, not just the corruption, but so many other treaties that he can break or alliances that he can form at the last minute for his own personal gain. But Lincoln, as we look forward to certifying on December 14th, do you have any thoughts on what Matt just laid out for us?
I have two thoughts. December 14th is when the Electoral College votes. The certification is little. So what happens is the states, Wisconsin's the last state to certify, and that'll be the 30th, this come Monday after Thanksgiving. Then the legislature still have one more bite at the apple. They can still say we reject the certification. I mean, it's extremely unlikely, but they will. They can. What we saw in Michigan is that they're not going to do that, at least in that state. The Electoral College will meet on December 14th, and by then I think it will be pretty clear that that Biden will become president. So I'm actually feeling reasonably confident about that. But with Trump, we're perpetually in this world of anything can happen, right? So whereas he's not going to find a way to stay in office, he will find a way to do damage in ways that right now we're not even focusing on, right? Because that's the nature of Trump. And because there's still a month between when the Electoral College meets, 5 weeks, and when Biden takes over as president. I also want to raise something else about why Giuliani and Trump and others, and also many Republican senators, are talking about election fraud. This goes back to something we've all discussed in the past, which is it is an effort to re-energize voter suppression, right? So the Democrats in the House have House Bill 1, which is basically the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, right? Which is to expand and strengthen access to the franchise for all Americans. This is what you do in a democracy. And according to international protocols about fair elections, one of the roles of the government is to make it easier for people to vote. The United States has signed on to that, and it continues to hold other countries to that standard. Apparently, we don't hold ourselves to that standard. But you could easily see a Senate commission. Let's imagine Mitch McConnell appoints, I don't know, Marco Rubio to run a Senate, and Ron Johnson from Wisconsin, to run a Senate commission to look at the problem of voter fraud and to come up with solutions. Now that would be a commission whose mission would be, in plain English, to stop African Americans, Chicanos in the Southwest, and others from voting. That's what that students do. That's what that commission would be doing. But they're presenting it in this framework of, well, the 2020 election, Biden won by a real margin, but we know there was fraud everywhere. We heard all these complaints, and now we have to address it. So I am really afraid that the Republicans are teeing up real pushback to efforts to expand access to the franchise, because lower turnout elections, particularly when those not turning out are heavily non-white, are the ways that the Republican Party can remain competitive.
Right. And I mean, in many ways, the way they've structured their arguments and their policy positions, that's one of the only ways they can remain relevant. I mean, we saw that, the inclusion of so many new voting rules based on COVID actually helped assist. I mean, in some ways, the coronavirus crisis helped bring in new people to the voting sphere, because, some states made voting by absentee ballot much easier. Other states introduced early voting, which many people took advantage of just so they could space things out. And all of a sudden we get different results. And Georgia's flipped, and Nevada and Arizona look very different, and Michigan and Wisconsin come back to the blue. So Matt, I want to shift gears just a little bit for you both and start talking about where, now that you and Lincoln have both said, we can pretty much, we never turn our back on someone like Donald Trump, but we can pretty much assume that December 14th will go off without a hitch, or relatively few hitches and glitches. And then Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will be sworn in on the 20th. So now let's shift to who they want to assist them in the process. We've started looking at cabinet positions. Some people are very excited. It looks like we could have someone from the Latino community who's head of Department of Homeland Security. There's possibility that the first Native American could be Secretary of the Interior. We have, sort of lifelong politicians and public servants who seem to be in the mix. Some of the more progressive Democrats are arguing that, this feels like Obama take 3. We have got a lot of people that we've seen before. Now they're just in elevated positions. We've seen John Kerry before. We've seen Janet Yellen before. So what is new? Can't we get sort of new lifeblood? We still don't have, even though it's an enormous number of women and people of color, Black Americans, compared to this administration, to the Trump administration, and even compared to the past, people still argue it's still at the really, really highest levels of power. It's still very old, very white, very Joe Biden-esque. What are you thinking about some of the selections thus far, and some of the arguments you're hearing about what Joe needs to do or not need to do?
So if we look at the campaign that Joe Biden ran, it really came down to 3 things. One was do no harm. 2 was steady leadership in a time of crisis matters. And 3 was the campaign needs to represent the diversity of this country. I think those are the 3 metrics by which he's filling out this administration now. You've seen in the announcements that have been made over the past week, Joe Biden intends on creating the most diverse cabinet, both in gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, and age. He's creating a diverse cabinet intentionally because he wants those diverse voices in the room. And I think what we're seeing, to your point, is a continued belief by the president-elect that experience in this time of crisis matters. And he wants people at the table who've been around the block before, who have experience on the issues that they will be tasked with handling during the crises that we face. And he wants those familiar faces around the table. On the flip side, I do, appreciate the concerns, particularly those on the left, that not even just the administration, but leadership in Congress, in terms of age, does not represent the youthfulness of this party. Speaking as one of those voters myself, I think many of us would like to see new faces, particularly in congressional leadership, in ways that they're not being represented today. But look, I think by and large, Joe Biden is transitioning into his presidency in the same way that he ran his campaign, which was focusing on experience, focusing on diversity, and doing no harm, and not causing reasons for sort of the apoplectic Fox News scandal cycle to overwhelm the initial days of his presidency.
Yeah, Lincoln, I mean, I want to hear what you have to say. I mean, I think that the youth aspect and certain religious aspects are definitely missing. I don't know. I mean, I think that there are some African Americans, but I don't know if they're in positions of real leadership beyond Kamala Harris. I think it remains to be seen, and he's still building his cabinet. I think for me, though, Lincoln, my biggest concern was even hearing the name Rahm Emanuel floating around let me know that Joe Biden had veered off course. Rahm Emanuel, who was Obama's chief of staff, I believe it was,
Yes.
and then became mayor of Chicago for 2 terms. But it's pretty apparent that either he did explicitly cover up or he had assisted in the cover up of the shooting of a 17-year-old Black teenager, Quan McDonald, in the city of Chicago, and the very few repercussions that were for him or for the Chicago Police Department. And so there's some real deep wounds, even hearing the name Rahm Emanuel, and the fact that he would even be in conversation made many people, especially people on the left, but just people who were excited and eager to see what Joe Biden is going to do in the upper levels of his administration, really disappointed. What are you thinking about some of the names that you've been hearing and some of the cabinet positions that, and keep in mind, none of these people have been confirmed yet. So it
Right.
really depends on the results of the Georgia Senate election. I mean, Mitch McConnell could essentially say, I don't want anyone, and hold up Joe
And,
Biden indefinitely.
and Mitch McConnell very well may do that. I mean, I just want to go back to your point about Rahm Emanuel, because pointing Rahm Emanuel would be a punch in the stomach to the left, who supported Joe Biden, to African Americans who supported Joe Biden in huge numbers. It's also worth noting that among the great advice Rahm Emanuel gave Barack Obama was to walk away from Obamacare when it looked like he didn't have the votes. And it was Nancy Pelosi who forced him to override, or encouraged him to override Rahm Emanuel. So I don't really know what Emanuel brings to the table other than a long time inside. Some of the other appointments, I think this age issue is really striking, right? Maybe Biden wants to feel young, so he surrounds himself with people like John Kerry. But on the other hand, there's some real wisdom to these appointments. Kerry is not on the kind of progressive lefty side of climate change, but when you make him the person who has the international climate change portfolio, that sends a message to the rest of the world that America is going to take this seriously. John Kerry is a former Secretary of State. Everybody knows him. He has relationships at the highest levels around the globe. So I actually like that appointment a lot. Janet Yellen at Treasury is a real triumph for I think for progressive forces within the party. It was never going to be Elizabeth Warren. Anybody who repeated that or hoped for that was just being silly, just like it's never going to be Bernie Sanders at Labor. And it's irresponsible of Bernie Sanders to push hard for that, because if he pushes for himself there, I mean, he's going to have the Senate. To make it clear, there's a Republican governor, both Massachusetts and Vermont. And that's why those people won't go into the cabinet. Biden, however, is choosing this cabinet because he wants one that can be confirmable. And I want you to point you to Secretary of State as an example of that. Anthony Blinken is highly qualified. He is going to be a very competent Secretary of State. But if you went to Wikipedia and typed in foreign policy establishment, you would see an image of Anthony Blinken's face, right? He is the epitome of the foreign policy establishment. But he's not Susan Rice.
Right.
And Susan Rice was looked at for vice president. And when she didn't get it, everyone assumed she was going to be Secretary of State. And in a scenario where the Democrats have 52 or 53 senators, then Susan Rice probably is nominated. There are some major, there's one in particular, there's defense on the foreign policy side and Attorney General on the domestic side, where we don't have appointments yet. And those to me are the most interesting to watch. We have a Latino running the Department of Homeland Security, but we've talked on this show, or nominated for that, how complex that term is. And maybe that's not the most useful term to use politically anymore. And Alejandro Mayorkas has a sterling resume, but a fascinating background. So it's a fascinating take on the complexity of various identities in the United States. Maybe that's a more academic point, but it's a way of saying that Xavier Becerra, who is the Attorney General from the state of California and who is Mexican American, might be a very, very good choice for Attorney General. So there's a lot to watch here.
Right. So without getting too far, of course, Matt, I want to just ask, what America is Joe Biden inheriting? So he's trying to build, as you said, a cabinet and an administration that looks like the rest of America. What does Joe Biden need to do? I mean, I always look to you as the Democratic strategist. He's sworn in. We'll have a truncated inauguration, obviously. I'm sure some people will go to DC, but it'll look nothing like, say, Barack Obama's balls every evening. I mean, it was just, a jubilant celebration. What does Joe Biden do on January 21st?
Well, look, I mean, he inherits a mess. I think that is one thing we can all agree on. And I think one of the real challenges in particular is the brain drain that's happened from our federal government over the past 4 years. I mean, we've lost decades and decades and decades of tenured experience from all of the various different governmental agencies that exist. And those spots need to be refilled, and they need to be refilled with competent, educated, thoughtful, knowledgeable, careerists who understand these issues and can rebuild the government that's been decimated under Donald Trump. It's not a sexy legacy for Joe Biden in any regard, but I think more than anyone else, he's up to the challenge and understands the challenge of rebuilding a federal government that can do good by its people and have people in places of power and authority who actually understand the issues that are being faced by Americans. The problem in the Trump White House was that we essentially lost decades of experience and had those gaps filled by, college graduates who, didn't even study, the agricultural issues that they are now faced with when they were appointed into a Department of Agriculture position. Mm-hmm. And so we've just lost that talent that needs to be regained for our government to do the work that it needs to do.
I think what's so interesting, though, Matt, is that some of the people who were put in these agencies and these offices, they were there specifically to destroy them, right? I mean, it's not even that they didn't have the experience in agriculture. They were there to actually make sure they undid years and years of policy. And we know that in the past few months, in the last year or two, because there's been so much turnover, some of those individuals, I mean, they didn't even graduate from college. They're seniors in college who are part of the Republican Society. I mean, it's just mind-boggling to think about the bureaucrats who have held this country together, essentially, as Lincoln has laid out. There has been a failure and a crisis because the leadership has just been so abysmal. All right, gentlemen. Well, I hate to end on that note, but that's all the time I have with both of you. I want you to have a wonderful holiday. Thank you for being here with me. I'm Dr. Christina Greer. You've been watching The Election Show. Be safe and have a wonderful week.